Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Method Ministries. I'm your host, Lucas Curcio, and today we're going to be talking about the myth of John Wesley and Eastern Orthodoxy. I'm going to be doing this also as a video showing why I'm against the Eastern Orthodox theology and how they and what they teach, especially in regards to soteriology. Because if you can imagine, if I'm a Wesleyan and I'm talking about what Wesley believed and how this is in contradistinction and in opposition to the EOC or Eastern Orthodox Church in this area, why I would too be against them. And I'm really also making this video because I find it strange and weird that there's a lot of Eastern Orthodox for really just reasons unknown to me. They want to say that John Wesley actually is in line with them. And I find this conversation tends to come up when we talk about justification by faith alone, how they want to then say that John Wesley actually taught that works are necessary for salvation too. And so this is completely wrong. It shouldn't be something that we should argue over. I mean, this really shouldn't be a debate. I think it's just, it's fundamental that, we can understand why John Wesley would not be in agreement with you and you can't claim him for your own. And again, I'm not sure why this happens. I don't know if people in, say, like the Martin Luther camp or the Reformed camp would have them, coming across the same type of rhetoric where people would say like Martin Luther actually agreed with us or John Calvin actually agreed with us. Maybe that does happen. I don't really. I'd be surprised if that did, because I do see the Eastern Orthodox don't like Martin Luther a lot, and they tend to use the same kind of talking points against him. But I'll leave that to the Lutherans and Reformers. But for now, I'm a Wesleyan, so we're going to talk about John Wesley versus Eastern Orthodoxy. And the primary tool I'm going to be using is the excellent book, John Wesley, A Theological Journey by Kenneth J. Collins. And this is a great book. You can buy it on Amazon. I'll drop the link in the description of this video. But Kenneth J. Collins, maybe you don't know him. He is a Wesleyan scholar. He's been studying Wesley for years, wrote numerous books, and has given tons of talks and lectures and just teachings on John Wesley, his life and his theology. So he's a really good authority for this. And he has in his book, and I was happy to find this on page 179. I'm sorry, page 195. He has a section titled "The Myth of John Wesley and Eastern Orthodoxy." And so we'll be reading some quotes from there, and I'll be giving commentary to drive the thesis home that John Wesley, and hopefully this video can serve to show that John Wesley was not and is not in agreement with Eastern Orthodox theology. And let's just put this to rest. So here's what he says to start out in the first paragraph. This is Kenneth J. Collins. The recent scholarship in Wesley studies suggests a strong relationship between Eastern Orthodoxy and the theology of John Wesley, especially on the subject of Christian perfection. The claim is actually based on an anachronistic reading of history and a confused employment of tradition. I love how he points this out, because when you look at the Eastern Orthodox versus Protestant debate, even the Roman Catholics, what it comes down to, it's not as cut and dry as they want to act like that it is. They think that tradition or history, church history, because this is what we're talking about. When we talk about tradition, we're talking about history. They act as if church history is this super clear thing where everybody just agreed with me on absolutely everything. And they disregard that there was diversity of thought, and there was actually schisms even predating Protestantism itself in the 16th century. And this is important to stress because you can really find this presupposition strong every time you come up against somebody who argues from a church magisterial / infallibility axiom, where they want to say that our church magisterium is what grants us the ability to determine doctrine and the right to interpret scriptures, which sides with us. And this is where I get my theology from. And you're just the one who is this person who's just rejecting it. And that's wrong, because that's based upon an anachronistic reading of history. And so what this means is that we all have the same history presented to us. The difference, though, is not the history. The difference is the interpretation of the history. And so Eastern Orthodox who want to say that John Wesley agreed with me, well, that's based upon a faulty interpretation of history, because history shows us, it should show us correctly if we use just a basic means of logic and reason, that John Wesley wasn't on your side. And I find, I say this because when I get in these arguments with people, I'll show really cut and dry explicit quotes by John Wesley saying we're justified by faith and faith alone. And then this pushback still comes like, no, actually, some people would agree with me. I haven't had one Eastern Orthodox priest say that he went to Asbury Seminary and he got his degree, and so he knows what he's talking about, and I don't know what I'm talking about. I mean, fair enough. Let's just say Lucas Curcio doesn't know what he's talking about. Well, I'm referencing to you a well-known, established scholar and respected scholar in this field. So if you don't believe me, at least believe Kenneth J. Collins. But let me just pause here for a minute, because Kenneth J. Collins is really going to be driving home the point that history, when John Wesley would quote and reference like some Eastern church fathers, the geography doesn't mean that they're agreeing or they are coming from the denomination of Eastern Orthodoxy. So geographical location is not a qualification. That's a fun word to say. Geographical location is not a qualification to say that somebody is a member of the EOC church, as in I interpret it today. Because when we look at history, there was a split in the year, 1053, 1043. My mind, the date, the exact date is escaping me, but you get the point. After 1,000 years of church history, there was a schism between the East and the West over the Filioque. There was matters of really politics. Did the Bishop of Rome have the authority to say that this is creedal for us? And was this fair? Because did they have that actual magisterium and the universal claim over the church to make that from the chair of Peter, as the Roman Catholic would say? The Roman Catholic would say yes. The Eastern Orthodox would say no, because the bishop, according to Eastern Orthodoxy, is first among equals. So this is when, though, when we look at this in history, this is when the Eastern Orthodox Church came into being, because pre-schism, you had East and West united. And so there was one true Holy Catholic Church in that regard. And Kenneth Collins goes on to make this point in saying that, hey, just because John Wesley would quote from church fathers in the East, it doesn't mean that's the Eastern Orthodox Church. And if we can realize this and make this distinction, this is going to help us out here. And so he says on page 196, Kenneth Collins, a tradition that is actually, and the tradition would be the Eastern Orthodox Church, a tradition that is actually a later historical development. To be sure, the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries of Christianity are best described not as a period of Eastern Orthodoxy or of the Roman Catholic Church, for that matter, but as a period of the ancient Catholic Church. Now, of course, Eastern Orthodox are going to push back and say, we never change, and you guys just schism, for us. Okay, but you got to understand is I'm not accepting those presuppositions as a Protestant. I don't fall within those a priori beliefs. So I'm looking at this historically, and the fact is there was a schism, and before this, the East and West were united. So mere fact with John Wesley quoting from Eastern fathers doesn't mean that he was quoting from the Eastern Orthodox Church. So that's important to realize, because then you can start to see that the view that would say John Wesley's in our camp is, as Kenneth Collins says, ahistorical. It's based upon a faulty interpretation. And so then moving on now into the next thing is, when we talk about John Wesley being within the camp of Eastern Orthodoxy, the primary issue that I also want to start with at the forefront is the matter of salvation by faith alone. Because if John Wesley taught salvation by faith alone, and if the EOC, the Eastern Orthodox Church, in case I didn't make that clear, if the EOC says no, salvation by faith alone is not true based upon the biblical testimony and the traditional testimony, and if John Wesley believes it, and if the EOC would say that somebody like John Wesley is a heretic or is schismatic outside of our church and he's teaching something contrary to it, again, I can't understand why you would want to have the need to claim John Wesley for yourself. What is with this desire? But the fact is, again, in case for those who do want to persist, is that they want to continue this rhetoric and say that John Wesley, he believed in agreement with us because John Wesley taught the necessity of works. And so this is a good question. Did John Wesley teach the necessity of works, in particular, specifically for justification? And the answer is no. And it shouldn't be hard for us to discover. It should be very easy for us to understand, especially when we have clear written sermons and documents by tons of historical evidence that John Wesley again taught sola fide. And so what I would like to fall back on, we'll return in a minute to Kenneth Collins' work, But what I want to fall back on, though, is two proofs of evidence to show that John Wesley is against Eastern Orthodoxy is his sermons, the sermons of John Wesley. So I have my sermons here edited, you can see, by Ken Collins and Jason Vickers. But I have two sermons marked out for us. And the first sermon I have is John Wesley's sermon, Justification by Faith. And if you have this book and you want to check me on it, the second paragraph on page 142, Wesley says, "Faith, therefore, is a necessary condition of justification." Now, the Eastern Orthodox can affirm this, right? They can say, yeah, well, of course, we're justified by faith. But the difference is, do you say it's by faith alone? John Wesley, right after that sentence, says, "Yea, and the only necessary condition thereof." So that should be enough to put it to rest. So if you agree with this, then maybe you have more credence to say that I'm in line with John Wesley. If you don't agree with this, then you don't have any credence, any kind of validness to say that John Wesley was in my camp, or at least drawing from my camp, whatever kind of argument that you want to use. And so off of that alone, no, John Wesley is against Eastern Orthodoxy, because when you study Wesley, justification by faith alone is a primary doctrine, and he would confess it's one of those doctrines where the faith stands or falls. So this is not something that we can just agree to disagree. This is a big issue. We should take this seriously. Did the death of Christ purchase our salvation on the condition of faith alone? Are we doing anything to contribute to our salvation, anything meritoriously? Is there anything necessary on our parts to ensure that we're saved? Well, if you're an EOC, you would say yes. If you're a Wesleyan, you would say no. John Wesley, who was he? Where did he fall in this camp? He said no. Now, it doesn't mean that faith won't produce works. Of course, John Wesley taught that. All Protestants do. Faith will produce works. Works do follow from it. But there's a difference between saying works are necessary and are meriting our salvation than saying works are the fruit of faith. And that's what John Wesley would stress. So there's no sense that we can fall back on and say, well, John Wesley believed in the necessity of works. Well, what do you mean by that? If you mean by faith will produce works, then absolutely. But if you mean that faith that works is a condition for our justification, then absolutely not. And John Wesley was clear on that. And I even have another sermon reference by him to drive this point home. In the Scripture Way of Salvation, where here John Wesley says, in my copy on page 586, he says, "Faith is the condition and the only condition of justification." So faith is the condition. And not only that, he goes to lengths to qualify that, to clarify that. It's the only condition. So there we have it. John Wesley is not in line with Eastern Orthodoxy, and it's a myth to say that he is. But now, going back to Kenneth Collins' work, now since we can establish that and hopefully get the groundwork laid out for us, there might be another means by which somebody would try to claim Wesley as a EOC member, whatever that means for them. Whether they want to use that to give their church some validation, or if they want to use that as a door to have a foot in the success of Western Christendom, particularly in the American colonies. Maybe, I'm not saying that's the case, but maybe it is, because I'm trying to find a motive for why they would want to say that Wesley's in their camp. Because maybe, again, if Wesley had such a big influence, which he did, on America, and God used him in a mighty way to bring about revival and spread scriptural holiness throughout the land, maybe by saying, hey, your boy John Wesley actually was just teaching what we've been teaching for thousands of years, then maybe you can then give us some more credit, and maybe also too we can have more of a foot in the door, that we're not just geographically in the eastern side of the world, and the West is just untouched by us. Maybe we can have a part in this. It seems a very possible motive. Other than that, I would be interested to find the real desire to heavily stress that John Wesley was on their side. But there's another objection that we got to deal with, because maybe, though, if somebody is a little bit more familiar with Wesleyanism, they want to then go down the Theosis route in regards to John Wesley's view on entire sanctification. And so Theosis in Eastern Orthodoxy, it seems to be a big part of how they do theology or how they view salvation in particular. And so theosis, just in a nutshell, it's essentially the view that we as Christians by faith in Jesus participate in the divine nature. There's a participation with God or in God, whatever kind of language that they would want to use. I'll allow them to further clarify that. And when you cross-reference this, or at least compare and contrast this with entire sanctification, they want to say, look, John Wesley is teaching what we've been teaching. Entire sanctification is theosis. Now, what's entire sanctification? Entire sanctification, you probably have heard this term, whether you agree with it or not, Christian perfection. And just to clarify on this point, because people often confuse what Christian perfection means, it doesn't mean that saints will be entirely perfect, but that saints will be filled by faith in God. Their hearts will be filled with supernatural holy love for God and for his neighbor, so he will not willfully commit a sin against God. And so it doesn't mean that there won't be involuntary sins. And so John Wesley made a distinction between voluntary and involuntary sins. And Christian perfection had to do with the fact that we won't commit voluntarily sins against God, because we're filled with supernatural holy love from God pouring out in our hearts by faith. And so this would be in matters of reaching a state of entire sanctification. Now, doesn't that sound like Eastern Orthodoxy, where you can participate in the divine nature through this process of what they call theosis? And I would say no, because I haven't heard a Eastern Orthodox church define it that way. But I would also fall back on the historical argument, as Ken Collins is right to point out, that Wesley, I'll just read it on page 195. So we go back to page 195. Kenneth Collins says that Wesley does not specifically single out Eastern fathers for any special attention. So John Wesley would never tell you that, hey, I'm believing in entire sanctification because this Eastern church father over here taught that. And even if he did, let's just say that he did, let's just grant him that. Again, I would want to find, okay, when was this written? Because again, just because you're in the geographical location of the East, it doesn't mean that you belong to the Eastern Orthodox Church as you define it today. And so that would be my first question. But regardless of even that, John Wesley never specifically quotes or singles out any church father. He never tells you this. There's not even a hint that John Wesley is saying, I'm getting my theology from the Eastern Church Fathers in regard specifically to entire sanctification. So right there alone, that should be something that we would expect to find if we're going to say that John Wesley was really just drawing from our well. Well, where's the evidence? Where's the proof for this? Really, if we're honest, if we read through his sermons, if we read through his notes on the Bible, if we read through even who influenced John Wesley. So John Wesley, he was influenced by early church fathers, and a big thing for Wesley was to go back to the primitive faith of the church. And the reason why is because the first centuries of the church, they were closer to the truth, and so there's less time for corruption to fall in. So we want to focus on this spear. What did they teach? Because they were closer to the apostolic tradition being handed down. And so John Wesley, he was influenced by church fathers, but if you look at who he was influenced by, it was more so the Western church fathers. And in particular, he also had a lot of agreement, or at least more so agreement, with Augustine. And if you know Augustine, one of his big markers was his teaching on original sin. And so John Wesley, Wesleyanism, we teach original sin. We believe in original sin. We believe it's biblical. And we even believe that infants are born, yes, they're born totally depraved, but also with the guilt of Adam. And so Eastern Orthodox Church is in disagreement with that. They have a different view of original sin. So John Wesley is subscribing to the same anthropological views / theological views of Augustine. So he's drawn from the Western church fathers in that regard. Now you can say, well, Lucas, doesn't that mean that, or just going back to your argument before, geographical location doesn't prove that he's belonging to this church? Yes, correct, it doesn't. But if we're going to be honest with the historical data here, John Wesley was way more influenced with Western fathers, and especially Augustine, who was a prototype for the Roman Catholic Church, and Lutherans and Reformers and Anglicans and Methodists. And so if we're going to argue down that route, again, the fact of the matter is John Wesley leaned west in his view of the doctrine of man and the view of original sin and what that means. Not the East at all. Now, the next thing I want to mention is John Wesley had some words to say against the Eastern Orthodox Church. And Collins talks about that, page 197. He says, moreover, in his sermon, The General Spread of the Gospel, which was produced in 1783, Wesley criticized those churches under the jurisdiction of the Patriarch of Moscow. And then he gives the quote of John Wesley. What do the Christians, so-called of the Eastern Church, dispersed throughout the Turkish dominions, know of genuine Christianity? Are they not the very dregs of mankind? Are they not the very dregs of mankind? And so John Wesley is really just saying that these churches have a nominal Christianity, and John Wesley, like his fellow brothers at the time, they were pushing for biblical scriptural Christianity that comes through the new birth. And when we talk about biblical scriptural Christianity, there's going to be a heavy emphasis on the new birth because that's what it means to be a true Christian. You're born again. And so John Wesley was against nominal Christianity. That was a big factor going on in the holiness movement known as Methodism, where there was nominal Christianity. People were raised in the church. They were baptized as infants, but their walk was not with Christ. So there was a call to be born again and to pursue Jesus Christ out of a true, genuine heart and religion that only comes through faith and the new birth in Jesus Christ. And so all this is to say is that let's get rid of this myth that John Wesley is in line with the Eastern Orthodox Church. He's not. He taught salvation by faith alone. He did not single out any church father to say that I'm drawing from this well. It's ahistorical to read that and interpret that as so. He clearly over time and again would say salvation is by faith alone. Even sanctification, by the way, if you want to argue that entire sanctification is just the version of theosis in the Eastern Orthodox Church, it's not, because even that, John Wesley said, comes by faith. And so there's nothing in line with John Wesley's thought that would be consistent with the Eastern Orthodox view of salvation and how we are saved. And this should be something that we should just recognize and agree on, that yes, Protestants and Eastern Orthodox Church have huge disagreements, and really the big part, or one of the big parts, comes down to, are we justified by faith alone, or is it faith plus works? Well, Protestants say it's faith alone, and John Wesley taught that. End of discussion. So it's a myth. John Wesley is against Eastern Orthodoxy, and I am too. It's unscriptural, and it's based upon a historical reading of church history. If you like this video, please hit the like button. It helps the algorithm push the video out. Share this video, subscribe, let me know what you think in the comment sections, and we're signing off. Take care, and God bless.